You know, we love to imagine Hollywood as this magical place where stars live in mansions, drive fancy cars, and retire to tropical islands when their careers wind down. But what if I told you that some of the most beloved faces from old Hollywood's golden era couldn't afford to stop working, even when their bodies begged them to rest? These weren't has-beens or forgotten names. These were legends, icons who defined entire generations of cinema. Yet behind the glamour and the red carpets, many of them faced a harsh reality that would shock you. They worked until their final days not because they loved the spotlight so much, but because they had no choice. Their stories reveal a side of Hollywood that the studios never wanted you to see, and today, we're pulling back the curtain on the financial nightmares that haunted some of the biggest stars ever to grace the silver screen. Stick around because what happened to these actors will change the way you see Hollywood forever. Let's start with someone whose name practically defined elegance and sophistication in classic cinema. Buster Keaton, the stone-faced genius of silent film comedy, was once one of the highest-paid performers in Hollywood during the 1920s. He earned thousands per week at a time when most Americans made less than $2,000 a year. Keaton owned his own studio, created masterpieces like The General and Sherlock Jr., and seemed untouchable. But then came the transition to sound films, and with it, Keaton's world collapsed. He signed a contract with MGM that stripped away his creative control, and the studio system chewed him up. His films under MGM were disasters compared to his earlier work. Depression and alcoholism took hold, his marriages fell apart, and the money vanished as quickly as it had come. By the 1930s, Keaton was broke, struggling to find work in an industry that had moved on without him. He spent the next 3 decades taking whatever roles he could get, bit parts, commercials, even appearances in beach party movies just to pay the bills. When he finally got recognition again in the 1960s, it was bittersweet. He worked right up until his death in 1966, not because he was chasing one more spotlight, but because he needed the paycheck. The man who had once owned Hollywood ended up scraping by in it. Then there's the heartbreaking case of Veronica, whose peekaboo hairstyle became a cultural phenomenon during World War II. She was a pin-up girl, a noir goddess who smoldered on screen opposite Alan Ladd in films like This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia. At her peak, Lake was making $5,000 a week, an astronomical sum for the 1940s. But Hollywood is brutal to women as they age, and by the early 1950s, her career had evaporated. The roles dried up, her looks changed, and the studios didn't want her anymore. What followed was a devastating downward spiral. Lake struggled with alcoholism, went through multiple divorces, and found herself completely broke. By the 1960s, she was working as a barmaid in a New York hotel, living in poverty and obscurity. Can you imagine that? One of the most glamorous faces of the 1940s serving drinks to strangers who had no idea who she was. She tried to make comebacks, took small theater roles, and even wrote an autobiography, but nothing could restore what she'd lost. When she died in 1973 from hepatitis and acute kidney injury, she was nearly penniless. The woman who had once been on every magazine cover in America died in relative anonymity, still trying to work, still trying to survive. Let's talk about someone whose name you definitely know, Mickey Rooney. This guy was a child star who became one of the biggest box office draws in Hollywood history. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Rooney was the #1 box office star in America for 3 consecutive years. He made millions for MGM with the Andy Hardy series and his partnerships with Judy Garland. But here's the thing about being a child star: someone else controls your money. Rooney's earnings were mismanaged by his family and guardians, and by the time he became an adult, most of it was gone. He went through 8 marriages, each one costly, and made a series of terrible financial decisions that left him broke despite decades of constant work. Even in his 80s, Rooney was still taking roles, not because he loved acting so much he couldn't stop, but because he had to. He testified before Congress about elder abuse, revealing that he'd been financially exploited by family members who controlled his finances. When he died in 2014 at age 93, his estate was worth less than $20,000. Think about that. One of the most successful actors in Hollywood history died nearly broke after working for over 80 years in the industry. Now let's get into someone whose story might surprise you even more, Ava Gardner. She was one of the most beautiful women ever to appear on screen, a genuine goddess who starred opposite the biggest leading men of her era. Gardner was married to Frank Sinatra, Mickey Rooney, and Artie Shaw, and her personal life was as glamorous as her film career. But beauty doesn't pay the bills when you're older, and Hollywood doesn't want you anymore. By the 1970s and 80s, Gardner was taking roles in disaster movies and television projects that were far beneath her talent level. Why? Because she needed the money. She'd gone through expensive divorces, lived lavishly during her peak years without saving properly, and suddenly found herself without the financial security she thought she'd built. She worked through health problems, including a stroke that affected her speech, because she couldn't afford to stop. When she died in 1990, she left behind an estate that was far smaller than anyone expected for someone who'd been such a huge star. Gardner spent her final years working not for the love of the craft, but out of financial necessity. Let's shift gears and talk about someone from an even earlier era, Lillian Gish, the First Lady of American cinema. Gish started her career in 1912 and worked with D.W. Griffith on silent masterpieces like The Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. She was a pioneer, a true artist who helped define what film acting could be. You'd think someone with that kind of legacy would be set for life, right? Wrong. Gish never commanded the enormous salaries that later stars would receive, and despite working steadily for decades, she never accumulated great wealth. She continued acting well into her 90s, taking roles in television and film right up until 1987 when she appeared in The Whales of August at age 93. While some praised her dedication to her craft, the reality was simpler: she needed to work. Gish had to support herself through continuous employment because she didn't have the financial cushion that would have allowed her to retire comfortably. She died in 1993 at age 99, having worked for over 80 years, much of it out of necessity rather than choice. Now we need to talk about someone whose career trajectory shows just how cruel Hollywood can be: Joan Crawford. Yes, that Joan Crawford, the woman who defined glamour and ambition on screen for decades. Crawford was a massive star from the silent era through the 1940s, winning an Oscar for Mildred Pierce in 1945. But by the 1960s, quality roles had evaporated. Hollywood had no use for older actresses, even ones as talented and legendary as Crawford. She took roles in horror films like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane and Straitjacket, films that were beneath her stature but paid the bills. And she needed those bills paid because her lavish lifestyle had consumed most of her earnings. Crawford kept working through health problems and personal struggles because stopping wasn't an option. When she died in 1977, her estate was valuable, but nowhere near what people expected for someone who'd been a top star for so many decades. She'd spent much of what she earned maintaining the image of Joan Crawford, the star, even when the roles and the money weren't what they used to be. Let me tell you about Peter Lorre, that distinctive character actor with the unforgettable voice and haunted eyes. Lorre fled Nazi Germany and became a Hollywood fixture, appearing in classics like The Maltese Falcon, Casablanca, and Arsenic and Old Lace. He was a sought-after character actor who brought something unique to every role. But character actors, no matter how talented, rarely commanded the salaries of leading men. Lorre struggled with morphine addiction, which he'd initially used for medical reasons, and the addiction destroyed his finances and health. By the 1950s, he was taking any role offered just to survive. He appeared in low-budget horror films, took television work, and kept pushing himself despite serious health problems. When he died of a stroke in 1964 at age 59, he left behind debts and an estate that was shockingly small for someone who'd appeared in so many memorable films. Lorre worked until his death not because he was chasing artistic fulfillment, but because he had no other option. Here's one that really hurts: Judy Garland. Dorothy herself, the girl who sang Over the Rainbow and captured hearts around the world. Garland was exploited by the studio system from childhood, given amphetamines to keep her energized during long shooting days and barbiturates to help her sleep. MGM controlled her life, her image, and her money. By the time she was an adult, she was already struggling with addiction and financial mismanagement. Despite being one of the most talented performers of her generation, Garland was constantly in debt. She went through bankruptcies, tax problems, and a series of expensive marriages and divorces. She kept performing: concerts, television appearances, film roles, because she was always trying to dig herself out of debt. In her final years, Garland was essentially broke, performing in small venues in London just to survive. When she died of an accidental overdose in 1969 at age 47, her estate was insolvent. She owed hundreds of thousands in debt. The woman who'd brought so much joy to millions couldn't even support herself, working desperately until the very end. Let's talk about someone who represented sophistication itself, Marlene Dietrich. The German-born icon who became a Hollywood legend with films like The Blue Angel, Shanghai Express, and Destry Rides Again. Dietrich was known for her sultry voice, her androgynous style, and her complete control over her image. But that control extended to her finances as well, and unfortunately, her spending matched her image. Dietrich lived extravagantly, maintaining the persona of a star even as quality roles became scarce. By the 1970s, she'd retreated from the public eye, becoming a recluse in her Paris apartment. But even in seclusion, she needed money. She'd spent lavishly throughout her career on everything from her wardrobe to supporting family members. Though she'd saved more wisely than some of her peers, her final years were still marked by financial concerns that prevented the comfortable retirement she deserved. Dietrich died in 1992 at age 90, having spent her final decades carefully managing limited resources, a far cry from the limitless glamour of her peak years. Now I want to talk about someone whose name might not be as immediately familiar, but whose career shows the same pattern, Butterfly McQueen. She's best known for playing Prissy in Gone with the Wind, the role where she famously said, "I don't know nothing 'bout birthin' babies." That one role typecast her for life, and McQueen struggled constantly to find work that wasn't demeaning or stereotypical. She refused many roles that she found offensive, which was admirable but costly. McQueen worked as a waitress, a dishwasher, and in other non-acting jobs between sporadic acting gigs. She continued taking small roles in film and television well into her 70s because she needed the income. McQueen never achieved financial security despite being part of one of the biggest films in Hollywood history. When she died in 1995 at age 84 from burns suffered in a kerosene heater accident, she was still struggling financially. Her story shows that even being part of Hollywood history doesn't guarantee anything. Let me tell you about Gloria Graham, a noir goddess who won an Oscar for The Bad and the Beautiful in 1952. Graham had that sultry, dangerous quality that made her perfect for film noir, and she worked steadily through the 1940s and 50s. But like so many actresses, the roles disappeared as she aged. Graham went through 4 marriages, including a scandalous one to her former stepson, and her personal life often overshadowed her talent. By the 1970s, she was taking whatever work she could find, regional theatre, minor film roles, television guest spots. She developed breast cancer in the late 1970s but continued working because she couldn't afford proper treatment and needed the income. Graham was literally performing on stage in England while dying of cancer, collapsing during a play in 1981. She returned to the United States and died shortly after at age 57. She worked until she physically couldn't anymore because stopping meant financial ruin. Here's another one that reveals the darkness behind the glamour, Joan Blondell. She was a pre-code Hollywood sensation, appearing in dozens of films during the 1930s, often playing wisecracking showgirls and working-class women. Blondell was enormously popular and worked constantly, but constant work doesn't always equal lasting wealth. She went through 3 marriages, including one to Dick Powell, and raised children while maintaining her career. By the 1960s and 70s, Blondell was taking supporting roles in films and television because she needed steady income. She appeared in everything from The Cincinnati Kid to television shows like Here Come the Brides, working right up until her death from leukemia in 1979 at age 73. Blondell never stopped working because she never had the financial freedom to do so, despite decades of steady employment in Hollywood. Let's talk about someone whose story is particularly tragic, Frances Farmer. She was a beautiful, talented actress in the 1930s and 40s who appeared in films like Come and Get It and Rhythm on the Range. But Farmer's story became a nightmare of mental illness, institutionalization and exploitation. After a very public breakdown, she was committed to psychiatric hospitals where she was allegedly subjected to horrific treatments including a lobotomy, though this has been disputed. When she finally was released and attempted to rebuild her life, Farmer was broken. She tried to resurrect her career with small film and television roles in the 1950s, but the work was sporadic and poorly paid. Farmer ended up working as a hotel clerk and doing other non-acting jobs just to survive. She eventually got a job hosting a local television show in Indianapolis, which she did until 1964. When she died of esophageal cancer in 1970 at age 56, she had very little. Farmer's story shows how the industry could destroy someone completely, leaving them with nothing but the desperate need to keep working. Now let me tell you about someone who many consider the greatest actor of all time, Charlie Chaplin. Yes, even Chaplin faced financial struggles, though his story is somewhat different. Chaplin was enormously wealthy at his peak, having created his own studio and owned his films outright. But he also faced political persecution during the McCarthy era, being essentially exiled from the United States in 1952 due to his political views. While in exile in Switzerland, Chaplin lived comfortably, but he continued working on films like A King in New York and A Countess from Hong Kong, partly because he needed to maintain his income. The exile had cost him access to the American market, his most lucrative audience, and he faced tax issues with the US government. Though Chaplin was never destitute like some on this list, he worked well into his 80s partly out of financial necessity, creating his final film at age 77. He died in 1977 at age 88, and while his estate was substantial, his later years were marked by the financial consequences of his exile and political persecution. Let's discuss someone whose beauty made her a star but whose age made her a Hollywood outcast, Mary Astier. She began her career in silent films in the 1920s and successfully transitioned to sound, winning an Oscar for The Great Lie in 1941. Astier appeared in classics like The Maltese Falcon and Meet Me in St. Louis, but by the 1950s, quality roles were scarce. She turned to television and supporting film roles, but also faced serious financial problems. Astier went through 4 marriages, struggled with alcoholism, and made several suicide attempts. She needed to keep working both for the income and for the structure it provided her life. Astier wrote several memoirs to supplement her income and continued taking acting roles into the 1960s. When she finally retired to the motion picture country home, it was because health problems made working impossible, not because she'd achieved financial independence. She died there in 1987 at age 81, having worked out of necessity for most of her life. Here's a name that might surprise you: Ginger Rogers. Yes, Fred Astaire's most famous dancing partner, the woman who did everything he did but backwards and in heels. Rogers won an Oscar for Kitty Foyle in 1940 and was one of the biggest stars of the 1930s and 40s. But even Rogers faced financial pressures in her later years. She went through 5 marriages, several costly divorces, and made some poor financial investments. By the 1970s and 80s, Rogers was appearing in television movies and taking stage roles in touring productions of shows like Hello Dolly and Mame. While she lived comfortably, she continued working well into her 70s partly because she needed the income to maintain her lifestyle. Rogers died in 1995 at age 83, having worked far longer than she probably would have if she'd had complete financial security. Let me tell you about Vincent Price, the master of horror with that distinctive voice and aristocratic bearing. Price appeared in countless horror films from the 1950s through the 1980s, becoming an icon of the genre. But horror films, while popular, didn't pay enormous salaries, and Price had expensive tastes. He was an art collector, a gourmet cook, and lived a cultured lifestyle that consumed his earnings. Price continued working constantly: films, television, voice work, even cooking shows and art documentaries, right up until his death in 1993 at age 82. While Price genuinely loved working and performing, he also needed the income to support his lifestyle and family. He worked through Parkinson's disease in his final years because stopping wasn't financially viable. Let's talk about Barbara Stanwyck, one of the most talented and respected actresses of Hollywood's golden age. Stanwyck starred in everything from screwball comedies to film noir to westerns, appearing in classics like Double Indemnity, The Lady Eve, and Ball of Fire. She was nominated for 4 Oscars during her film career and won 3 Emmys for television work. But Stanwyck came from poverty and never fully escaped the fear of returning to it. She worked constantly throughout her life, transitioning from film to television in the 1960s with shows like The Big Valley. Even after that series ended, she continued taking guest roles and television movies into her 70s. Stanwyck was known for her professionalism and work ethic, but that work ethic was partly driven by financial anxiety. When she died in 1990 at age 82, she left a substantial estate, but she'd worked practically until her death, partly because she could never shake the fear of being broke again. Here's someone whose story shows the particular cruelty Hollywood showed to women: Gloria Swanson. She was one of the biggest stars of silent cinema, commanding enormous salaries in the 1920s. Swanson produced her own films, lived extravagantly, and seemed untouchable. But the transition to sound and changing tastes left her behind. By the 1930s, her career had largely evaporated. Swanson made occasional films, but nothing like her earlier success until Sunset Boulevard in 1950, where she played a forgotten silent film star, art imitating life. But that comeback didn't lead to lasting financial security. Swanson continued working sporadically in film and television, doing stage work, and even appeared in commercials and on game shows to earn money. She worked into her 80s, taking whatever opportunities arose, because complete retirement wasn't financially possible. Swanson died in 1983 at age 84, having spent her final decades working to maintain a fraction of the lifestyle she'd once known. Now let's talk about someone who became a character actor legend: Lionel Barrymore. He came from the famous Barrymore acting dynasty and had a long career in both silent films and sound films. Barrymore won an Oscar for A Free Soul in 1931 and became beloved for playing crusty but lovable characters, most famously in the It's a Wonderful Life as Mr. Potter. But Barrymore suffered from severe arthritis that eventually confined him to a wheelchair. Despite his physical limitations, he continued working constantly because he needed the income. He appeared in dozens of films through the 1940s and early 1950s, performing from his wheelchair when necessary. Barrymore also did radio work to supplement his income. He worked until shortly before his death in 1954 at age 76, having spent his final years in considerable pain but unable to stop working due to financial necessity. Let me tell you about someone whose name defined an era: Fatty Arbuckle. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was one of the biggest comedy stars of silent film, rivaling even Charlie Chaplin in popularity and earnings in the 1910s. But in 1921, he was accused of rape and murder at a party, leading to 3 trials. Though he was eventually acquitted, his career was destroyed. The scandal bankrupted him through legal fees and lost income. Arbuckle tried to work under a pseudonym as a director but struggled constantly. By the time he was finally able to return to acting in the early 1930s, he was a shadow of his former self. Arbuckle worked desperately to rebuild his career and finances, but he died of a heart attack in 1933 at age 46, shortly after signing a new contract. He spent his final years trying to work his way back from financial and professional ruin, working out of absolute necessity. Let's discuss someone who represented elegance in Hollywood: Loretta Young. She began as a child actress and became a major star through the 1930s and 40s, appearing in films like The Farmer's Daughter, for which she won an Oscar in 1947. Young successfully transitioned to television with The Loretta Young Show in the 1950s, winning 3 Emmy Awards. But maintaining her image and lifestyle was expensive, and Young continued working through the 1980s, well into her 70s. She appeared in television movies and took other roles partly because she needed the income to support herself and family members she was helping financially. Young died in 2000 at age 87, having worked far longer than many expected, driven partly by financial necessity despite her success. Here's someone whose story is particularly sad: Hattie McDaniel, the first African American to win an Oscar for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind in 1939. Despite her historic achievement and considerable talent, McDaniel faced constant discrimination and limited opportunities due to racism in Hollywood and society. She was typecast in servant roles and paid far less than white actors of comparable fame. McDaniel worked constantly out of necessity, appearing in dozens of films and later in the radio and television versions of Beulah. But the work never translated into financial security. When she died of breast cancer in 1952 at age 57, her estate was modest. McDaniel had worked her entire life, achieving historic recognition but never escaping the financial struggles that limited opportunities created. Let me tell you about someone who became a symbol of old Hollywood's faded glory, Bette Davis. She was one of the most talented and respected actresses in Hollywood history, winning 2 Oscars and being nominated 10 times. Davis was a powerhouse who fought the studio system and demanded better roles for women. But by the 1960s, quality roles had largely disappeared. Davis famously took out an ad offering herself for work, and she appeared in horror films like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane to Pay the Bills. She continued working through the 1970s and 80s, appearing in television movies, series, and lower-budget films. Davis had gone through 4 marriages, raised children, and faced significant medical expenses. She worked until shortly before her death in 1989 at age 81, having spent her final decades taking whatever roles were offered because financial security remained elusive despite her legendary status. Now let's talk about someone who represented a different kind of tragedy, Lana Turner. She was a bombshell star of the 1940s and 50s, appearing in films like The Postman Always Rings Twice and Peyton Place, for which she received an Oscar nomination. Turner was married 8 times, and those marriages and divorces consumed much of her earnings. She also faced a major scandal when her daughter stabbed Turner's abusive boyfriend to death in 1958. By the 1960s and 70s, Turner was taking television roles, appearing in series like Falcon Crest in the 1980s. She continued working partly because she needed the income to maintain herself and support family members. Turner died in 1995 at age 74, having worked far longer than she'd probably imagined during her peak years as a glamorous star. Here's someone whose career shows the limited opportunities for character actors. Elisha Cook Jr. He appeared in hundreds of films and television shows over 6 decades, becoming one of the most recognizable character actors in Hollywood. Cook appeared in classics like The Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep, and The Killing, always delivering memorable performances. But character actors rarely commanded high salaries, and Cook worked constantly out of necessity. He continued taking roles well into his 80s, appearing in films and television because he needed the income. Cook died in 1995 at age 91, having worked for over 70 years, driven by financial necessity rather than a choice to continue acting. Let's talk about someone who became an icon of sophisticated sexuality, Rita Hayworth. She was one of the biggest stars of the 1940s, becoming a pin-up sensation during World War II and starring in films like Gilda and CoverGirl. But Hayworth went through 5 marriages, including to Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan, and the divorces were costly. By the 1960s and 70s, she was taking supporting roles in lower-budget films because she needed the money. Tragically, Hayworth was developing Alzheimer's disease, though it wasn't diagnosed until 1980. She struggled to work through the early stages of the disease because she needed the income. When she died in 1987 at age 68, her estate was modest considering her years as a top star. Hayworth worked as long as she possibly could, driven by financial necessity even as her health failed. Now let me tell you about someone who represented a bygone era, Lillian Roth. She was a Broadway and Hollywood star in the late 1920s and early 1930s, but her career was destroyed by alcoholism. Roth's story was told in the book and film I'll Cry Tomorrow, which documented her struggles and recovery. After getting sober, Roth attempted comebacks but never regained her earlier success. She worked in nightclubs, did stage work, and took whatever performing opportunities she could find because she needed the income. Roth continued working into her 60s, struggling financially despite her earlier success. She died in 1980 at age 69, having spent decades trying to work her way back from the devastation alcoholism had caused her career and finances. Let's discuss someone who became a television star after a film career, Donna Reed. She won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity in 1953 and appeared in classics like It's a Wonderful Life. Reed successfully transitioned to television with The Donna Reed Show, which ran from 1958 to 1966. But even with that success, Reed continued working afterward, appearing in television movies and series. She took a role in Dallas in the 1980s, replacing Barbara Bel Geddes, partly because she needed the income. Reed had gone through a divorce that affected her finances, and she worked into her 60s to maintain financial stability. She died of pancreatic cancer in 1986 at age 64, having continued working out of financial necessity despite her earlier success. Here's someone whose name is synonymous with tough guy roles, Robert Mitchum. He was a major star from the 1940s through the 1990s, appearing in classics like Out of the Past, The Night of the Hunter, and Cape Fear. Mitchum worked constantly throughout his life, appearing in over 100 films. While he commanded good salaries, Mitchum supported a large family and had expensive habits. He continued taking roles well into his 70s, appearing in television series like War and Remembrance and films until shortly before his death. Mitchum died in 1997 at age 79, having worked practically until the end partly because he needed to support his family and lifestyle. Let me tell you about someone who represented youthful innocence in old Hollywood, Margaret O'Brien. She was a child star in the 1940s, winning a special juvenile Oscar in 1944. O'Brien appeared in films like Meet Me in St. Louis and was one of the biggest child stars of her era. But like many child stars, the money she earned was mismanaged and largely gone by the time she reached adulthood. O'Brien struggled to transition to adult roles and faced financial difficulties throughout her life. She continued taking occasional roles in film and television into her 70s and 80s because she needed the income. O'Brien's story shows how even the most successful child stars often ended up working out of necessity in their later years. Finally, let's talk about someone who became a symbol of dignity in old Hollywood, Sidney Poitier. He broke racial barriers, becoming the first black man to win the Oscar for Best Actor for Lilies of the Field in 1963. Poitier was a trailblazer who appeared in groundbreaking films like In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Unlike many on this list, Poitier managed his finances well and became a successful director. However, he continued acting and taking roles into his 80s partly to maintain his lifestyle and support various family members. Poitier worked until his death in 2022 at age 94, having spent over 70 years in the industry. While financial necessity wasn't as pressing for him as for others on this list, he still worked far longer than necessary partly due to financial considerations. These stories reveal a harsh truth about Hollywood that the studios never wanted you to know. The glamour was real, but so was the exploitation. Many of these stars worked for studios that controlled their contracts, their images, and their earnings. They faced predatory business managers, expensive divorces, limited opportunities as they aged, and a system that valued them as commodities rather than people. The women on this list particularly faced Hollywood's brutal ageism, finding quality roles disappearing after 40 while their male counterparts continued working. The system chewed them up and spit them out, leaving many broke despite decades of work that had enriched studios and producers. What we can learn from these stories is that Hollywood's golden age wasn't golden for everyone, and the price of fame was often far higher than the rewards. These legends worked until they couldn't anymore, not out of vanity or obsession, but out of simple economic necessity. Behind every glamorous image was a human being struggling to survive in an industry that valued profit over people.